Alright everyone, so this presentation is going to go over Chapter 12, Arousal Regulation. I know we just did a chapter over stress, arousal, and that kind of stuff. So now we're going to look at actual regulations of how do we control arousal. Also, just as a note, this chapter's presentation is going to not follow directly along with the chapter in the book. I'm going to create a second presentation that just goes over coping. Coping's a little bit different than what we're going to talk about here in this presentation. Okay, so some objectives that we're going to go over pertaining, I know it says chapter, but really this is just pertaining to this presentation. We're going to talk about how to understand or looking at increasing self-awareness of arousal states. We're going to talk about somatic, cognitive, and multimodal anxiety reduction techniques. Like I said, the coping strategies, number 3 here, we're going to talk about in a different presentation. We're also going to talk about on-site relaxation tips, which is pretty simple. Talking about something called the matching hypothesis, and also identify some techniques to actually raise arousal. Because as we talked about previously, sometimes some people need to be amped up for a competition to really perform at their best. So what I've got here is in the PowerPoint that I've provided. This is a link to a YouTube video from the movie, I think, what is it, The Replacements. So watch the video. It kind of talks about, I mean, there's kind of some goofy stuff that's not related to this talk within the video, but they start talking about quicksand and how sometimes things can be going so well, everything's going right, but then before you know it, your performance starts to go sour, it goes bad, and then no matter how hard you try, the more amped up or the more you get going, you only seem to do worse and worse. So watch this video. It's kind of interesting, and I want you to think about this idea of quicksand and arousal, and then also performance. So the first thing I want to talk about is this idea of self-awareness and arousal. The book talks a good bit about this, but really what we want to talk about is how do we become aware of how amped up we are? And this is really, really important because understanding how people cope with anxiety is actually more important than how much anxiety they experience. And if you think about that a little bit abstractly, that'll make more sense, because if someone is coping by using a imagery script when they're experiencing muscle tension, you can see how there's a bit of a disconnect here, and maybe it's not the most appropriate or adaptive way to cope with this anxiety that the athlete's feeling. Now, there have been some studies that have compared elite athletes with non-elite athletes, and primarily the difference, and I think we've talked about this before, is elite athletes tend to see these feelings of anxiety or arousal really as facilitative rather than debilitative, and it's a matter for sports psych people to really delve into with their clients or whoever they're working with, is how to change that mindset, and how we can kind of flip things and say, okay, anxiety, this feeling of anxiety might be a way of your body telling you that this is an important event, and a great performance is about to come. So we're going to talk a little bit about anxiety reducing techniques. There's 3 broad types that we're going to talk about. So somatic anxiety reduction, cognitive anxiety reduction, and then multimodal anxiety reduction packages. Okay, so the first one, dealing with somatic anxiety reduction. So again, this really focuses more on the body. One of probably the most popular ones out there, I believe in the textbook, there's actually an entire page dedicated to how to do progressive muscle relaxation. So PMR, or as it's called here, just progressive relaxation, is really grounded in this idea of creating tension in your muscles and then releasing it and focusing on that feeling. So to do a quick exercise of this, you could clench a fist, or really clench your toes on your feet, and try and do that for about 5 seconds and really clench and just focus on that feeling, the tension that's building up in your muscles, and then release, and just focus on that feeling, the difference in feelings. And this is actually a great technique when you're anxious, because it makes you a lot more aware of your body and the tension that your muscles are holding, but also makes you aware of what relaxation in your muscles would feel like. There's also breathing control or breath control. So what we find is a lot of times when an athlete's feeling pressured or is very anxious, they start to tense up. This isn't anything bizarre, excuse me. But when that happens, the athlete's breathing becomes shorter. It's more shallow, and it's not as regular. There isn't this natural flow. But when you're calm and relaxed, you tend to just be able to inhale and exhale smoothly, deeply, and even rhythmically. And another great example with this is, a lot of people will say focus on breathing from your belly. So whenever I've worked with athletes and used a breathing technique, is I always call it belly breathing. We're going to focus just on our belly, and filling our belly with air, our stomach with air. So feel your stomach rise and then slowly release the air. And again, the idea here is really focusing on the breathing, not on any specific thoughts, anything like that. But also this will generally get your heart to calm down a bit, and just really bring your mind and your body to peace. And the last one here is biofeedback, and they give some good examples in the chapter about this. But really, what this speaks to is using certain technologies to make an athlete more aware of how their body reacts to physiological stress. Okay, so in the textbook, they have a great example where they talk about putting electrodes on an athlete's upper back, and when the muscles in the upper back become tense, the electrodes produce a high clicking noise that the person can hear. And what this does is it allows the athlete to know, oh, these muscles are really tense right now. I need to calm down. I need to relax. And they can kind of work through whatever methods they have established for relaxing that muscle group. So the next set of techniques we're going to talk about deal with cognitive anxiety reduction. The first one's called relaxation response, and really what this is it's meditation, but it's with its removal of any spiritual or really religious significance or elements to this. So the idea is to really teach the individual to quiet the mind, to concentrate maybe on one thing, one word, and focus on our breathing, and applying, like I say here, the elements of meditation. So there's four listed in the chapter. Some keys for this technique. The first one being to find a quiet space where there aren't any distractions. The second is to assume a comfortable position, so whether that be sitting, laying down, whatever it might be. And then the third one is a mental device, is what they call it, but really this is that idea of focusing in on one word. Okay, maybe it's something like calm, relax, something like that, but just something that you repeat over and over throughout your breathing. And then the last element here is a passive attitude. And the core element of this is really not to focus on anything that comes to mind, but instead allow thoughts, images, whatever it might be, to simply pass through your mind. Trying not to attend to them, but simply let them come and go as they please, and not get fixated on any one element. The next strategy is the autogenic training. So the idea here is really focusing on producing two sensations throughout your body, feeling of warmth and heaviness. And the one, to be honest, I've done this one. I've thought through this one a bit. It can be a little bit hard to explain, but think of just laying down. Maybe if you were going to take a nap, or if you're just relaxing. And you just think to yourself, I'm sinking into the bed, I'm sinking into the couch, whatever it might be, the floor. And then you focus to, my arms are heavy, sinking further down. And then you say things such as, my arm is warm as it sinks, as it's heavy. And the thinking here is, the more that you go through this, it's kind of a different spin on this relaxation response technique. So a type of meditation where really you're focusing on producing these feelings in your body. Now the next set has to do with multimodal anxiety reduction techniques, and this one's somewhat straightforward. So multimodal just means multiple methods. So the primary ones are these SMTs, or stress management training protocols. So many of them are cognitive and affective in their nature. But the idea is, we're going to teach a person specific integrated coping responses to use for relaxation, but also there will be a cognitive or mindful component to control any emotional arousal. Now there's a picture here in the textbook. This is on page 279, and it seems somewhat busy, but what you need to focus in on is we have some situation. So we're put into some sporting context, physical activity, whatever it might be, and we appraise the situation, or we kind of assess what's going on. What's going on in the situation or the event, and what is our ability to cope with the stress that's being produced. And of course, that's going to lead to some physiological responses. Now, what might seem a little bit confusing is, if we start following the arrows here, really we just go from this first one here with mental appraisal straight to the response, and we go back and forth. There's no way to get into these other ones. And that's where our training comes in with a practitioner or sports psych consultant, where they're going to teach an individual maybe some relaxation skills. So maybe we're doing some progressive muscle relaxation, whatever it might be. But then also we might do some cognitive restructuring. So again, this is more of just the mental side and not the physiological side. So cognitive restructuring is something like thought stoppage, where we're changing or reframing negative phrases that might be coming through our mind. So what we do is we actually use these to create some kind of an integrated approach, where we're utilizing both this cognitive side and a physiological side to deal with the stress that we're encountering. Another method along the same lines is the stress inoculation theory. And this one's somewhat straightforward. So an individual is exposed to a stressful event, and they learn to cope with that stress. Okay, whatever methods, whatever integrated methods they decide to go with or practice. But then what the consultant or the athlete will do is, they're going to basically increase the amount of stress. So think about, if someone's having issues coping with the stress of free throws, well, maybe you start out just taking them in an empty gym. Then you focus on bringing in distractors, and then you start blaring music in the background. So we're constantly upping the amount of stress that we're putting the athlete in, and then we're practicing these integrated skills and how they can be used to deal with this stress. So there's really 4 phases of stress management training. So first, there's a pre-treatment phase. This is where we're going to meet with the athletes and kind of assess, hey, what things stress you out? What skills are you using to deal with that stress or to cope with that? So what are things that definitely work? What are some strategies that don't work for you? Then there's this treatment rationale phase, and this is where it's more of an educational component where you're trying to communicate to the athlete, the reasons or the basically the reasons why some skills work and some skills don't, and maybe how novel skills or ones they haven't tried could also be used in certain stressful situations. And then the next one, the next step is skill acquisition. And this is really just when you're practicing and utilizing the coping skills or these anxiety reduction techniques um, in an attempt to deal with anxiety, to bring an athlete to their optimal level if they're too amped up. And then the last one is really just practice, 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 right? So we talked about how PSTs or psychological skills need to be practiced. Well, these are psychological skills. And there's even a physiological skill component to this as well. But the athlete needs to recognize you have to practice these. Otherwise, they're not going to be as effective as they could be. There was one more mentioned in the book. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one, but it's this idea of hypnosis. You can use hypnosis as well to deal with anxiety. We don't see it that often. You need specialized training to do hypnosis with an athlete. Many of us are going to be familiar with what hypnosis is, but it's an altered state of consciousness that really an individual can induce. And it's when a person is unusually very relaxed, but also responds to suggestions. And those suggestions, the goal of them is to alter some kind of perception outside of this hypnotic state. So another thing I'd like to talk about is the matching hypothesis. This is something that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on because I think it's extremely basic and it makes sense. But really all the matching hypothesis is matching your technique for dealing with stress or reducing anxiety to what is causing the anxiety. So think of it this way: if you have if your muscles are extremely tense, you're not going to use an imagery script or a thought reframing or a thought restructuring. You're going to focus on something that's going to relieve the stress in your muscles. Okay. Same thing for something in your mind. Okay. So if you have lots of negative thoughts and it just keep on, you're kind of in the hamster wheel in your mind, and things are just going around and around and around, but you're not making any progress, you're probably not going to do a progressive muscle relaxation procedure or protocol to deal with those thoughts in your head. Now, that being said, there are some crossover effects, right? Because if we did something like the autogenic relaxation, where we're trying to make our limbs and body feel heavy and warm, okay, if we're focusing in on that stuff, we're probably not focusing on our thoughts. So that might help us deal with negative thoughts that are in our head. So this is basically what I just said. Cognitive anxiety should be treated with mental relaxation. Somatic anxiety, so body anxiety, should be treated with physical relaxation. Now, if you're not sure which one you should use, which technique, it can be a problem, but then we have these integrated or these multimodal techniques where you're kind of getting a little bit of both. And usually you can tease apart then which ones are working best for the athlete. Another element here is with the matching hypothesis is this element of social support, okay? And really to produce maximum anxiety reduction, okay? There's some social support that can actually help with that. So if we think of specific information we might get, or when we say emotional social support, someone who's there to sympathize with us, that might help us deal with our anxiety problems. Okay, the book goes over this a bit in depth. Well, not too in depth, but definitely pay attention to that. Social support can really be a great outlet for dealing with anxiety and and a lot of issues that athletes confront in sport. So really quick, some on-site relaxation tips. These are pretty simple again. Smile when you feel tension coming on. So it's just this idea of having fun. Try to have fun whenever you can. Practice in stressful situations. So you can imagine if many of you have walked by the MSU football training facility when the guys are out there. A lot of times they have music or crowd noise blaring, and that's to get the athletes used to that kind of environment, that stimulus. So that way it's almost second nature to perform in a loud environment. Sometimes slowing down, taking your time. A lot of the techniques we just covered involve taking time. Autogenic relaxation takes up to half an hour to 40 minutes to really do if you're focusing in on it. And then lastly, coming prepared with a good game plan. It's always this idea of preparation. So being prepared for any stress that might come up is only going to help you in the long run. Now, just because we've been talking about how to deal with anxiety, if you're really anxious, we should also talk about, well, what if you're under aroused, you're not amped up enough? And some signs of that, if you're moving slowly, you're just looking sluggish out there, your mind's wandering a lot, it's not very easy to stay on task. You're lacking concern about how you're going to perform. You're not anticipating the event or looking forward to it. There's no really enthusiasm. And then there's that age-old feeling of just lead legs, right? Where you just can't seem to get up and get going. So if we have these issues with not enough arousal, maybe there are ways that we can get someone kind of hyped up or ready to go and be on task. And remember, we talked about this before with like the individual zones of optimal functioning. Is our goal is to get athletes to an optimal level of arousal. Not, some athletes need to be really high, some need to be low, some need to be in the middle. And for every athlete, it's going to be a little bit different. So a lot of times, pep talks, these are, again, something that coaches think they've always got to do. Pep talks are these motivational speeches at halftime. Sometimes that pushes people over the limit. Okay, so that can help some athletes, but not everybody. Okay, so if it needs to be raised, if we need someone to get a bit hyped up, okay, it should be done deliberately with the awareness of that person's optimal arousal level, and that can be kind of tricky. It needs to be tailored for each athlete. So here again are some techniques that you could use. Increasing your breathing rate. That's not to say take really quick short breaths, but just progressively speeding up your breathing. Acting energized, that's the whole idea of faking it till you make it, because if you're acting that way, your body's going to eventually kickstart. Okay, use mood words or positive statements. So the idea here is, again, maybe words like energy, you're going to do great, just these little statements. Get pumped up, get ready to go, game time, whatever it might be, to really get you focused on what you're about to do. Many athletes like listening to music. Energizing imagery, we'll talk about imagery in another lecture, but energizing is just seeing yourself full of energy, running fast, quickly, whatever it might be. But then some athletes actually need some kind of pre-competition workout. Because that gets the blood flowing, usually gets their mind focused on the task at hand. And just to kind of talk a little bit more about pep talks, a lot of people use them. They're not always great, but there are some general guidelines for a successful one. You want to give a plan. You don't want to be ambiguous in what you're saying, or the coach doesn't want to do that. You want to make the athletes or team believe they can win, or that they are all making some kind of contribution towards a successful effort. Don't lie to people. Don't blow smoke. Athletes will see through that. Make sure you're being yourself. And to some degree, you'll want to use humor, not to the point where it's, just way overkill, but cracking a joke here and there doesn't help. It shows that you're human to your team. So I put a link here to a video from Any Given Sunday. A lot of you have probably seen this, but check this out. It's actually a pep talk that was used in a movie, and a lot of sports psych people like to reference this when we're talking about pep talks. Okay, so that's the end of the first presentation with this chapter on arousal regulation. Go ahead, move to the next lecture or video. That one's going to be over just this concept of coping. All right, thanks, guys.